Let me explain one of the solutions. So in this solution, Greenville idle competition. Now write a program named Greenville revenue, which they've already created the class for me, and class is just a way to group your code. That prompts a user for the number of contestants entered in last year's competition and in this year's competition. Display all the input data. So in other words, when you're asked to input information, wherever you see that the read line statement, it means the program is going to pause and read in a line of whatever you've typed in. It's going to read that line in. So when you store that to a variable, you're going to display that variable later on. Okay. For this year's competition, if each contestant pays a $25 entrance fee. Also display a statement that indicates whether this year's competition has more contestants than last year's. Okay, so let's go ahead and take a look at this. First, when I create my program, the first thing I want to do is create this entrance fee. And so I create a variable, and you notice that this variable name, usually variable names by tradition start with a lowercase letter. This one is all uppercase, and that's because it's a constant, which means it's going to be the same throughout the program, and this entrance fee will never change. So I have to say what it's going to be throughout the program. In this case, it's going to be 25, and our units, we just happen to know are dollars. But you notice I don't put a dollar sign in here. I don't put, if this were a large number, I wouldn't put commas in there either. You just type in the plain number. Okay, so this is an integer or a whole number. Not so sure how practical that would be. Usually I would use something where I could use a decimal value as I go through here, but integer will work for this example. Okay, so when I read something in, or in other words, I create an entry string, it is a string data type. Now, data types are something you need to start becoming accustomed to because they're used in all programming languages. In other words, what type of information am I getting into the computer? Is it numbers? And if it is, what kind of number? Is it a whole number? Is it does it have a decimal value? Is it a huge number? Is it a really small number? What type of number? And in this case, is it going to be a string, which means just a string of characters? Now, a string of characters, and I'm not going to be able to add, subtract, multiply, divide, any of those. Even if that string happens to contain numbers, if it's a string, I'm not going to be able to do anything mathematical with it. Okay, so I create a variable. The name of the variable is num this year. If I were using an IDE, I can make this variable very descriptive if I want to. Now, I can't start off with any numbers when I create a variable. I don't want to put any spaces in there when I create a variable. I don't want to have some special character at the beginning of this. I just want to start off with a lowercase letter. And I don't have to, but that's kind of the convention. Start with a lowercase letter on variable names. Okay, so num this year. Now that would probably be the number of contestants this year. Num last year would be the number of contestants last year. Now these should be integers because you're not going to have 2.5 contestants. So or 2 3/4 contestants. You will have whole numbers in this case. So an integer type is reasonable in this. Revenue. How much money was made? Again, in a real app, you probably wouldn't make that an integer value. You'd probably have dollars and cents. So you'd either use a double or more than probably a decimal data type. Okay, Boolean data type. That's one that's used quite often, and what it means is that true or false. And in this case, is this year greater? So is this year's number of contestants indicates whether this year's competition has more contestants. Is this year have more contestants than last? Okay, so the program's going to run. Now I have write in here. Now I don't need to put in the system.console.write. I can just put in write because I have this statement up here which says, okay, we're going to be using system.console in this program, so we can save the typing on this. So this gives us a little bit of a shortcut. So I type in write, and I don't type write line, I type write. And when this program runs, it's going to display, it's going to write to this terminal console window. It's going to write, enter the number of contestants last year. And then if you want, you can put in these little arrow signs in there. And then it's going to pause because it's going to wait, and it's going to wait for the user to type in some value. So when this runs, it's going to run, and it says the number of contestants last year. And so I'll make up a number. I'll say last year we had 4 contestants. So it's waiting for that value to be typed in, and then when I press the enter key, it's going to store that into entry string. But when you have read line, anything that's typed in is a string. And later on, I want to do some calculations with this value. So to do that, I need to convert entry string into an integer. 32-bit integer, I could make it 16-bit integer or 64-bit integer. 32-bit is fine. Convert the string into an integer and then store it into the variable called num last year, or the number of contestants last year. And then we do the same thing for the number of contestants this year. So I'll press the enter key up here, and it says the number of contestants this year, and I'll say 5. Now it's going to enter the number of contestants this year. So it stored that into string, and then again it converts that string into a number, or an integer in this case, and stores it into this year. So the entrance fee, you remember that was fixed. It's a constant. That's why it's in all uppercase. So that's pretty easy to see. When I'm looking at my code, I know that this is going to be a constant. So, and it was set at $25 or 25. We need to know what the units are. And then this asterisk means I'm going to multiply that to the number of contestants this year. So 25 times the number of contestants this year, which will be 5. And then and then there's a Boolean, it's not a calculation, but a Boolean comparison, a yes or no comparison, right here that says, is this year greater than, and this little symbol here, hopefully you can see it, is a angle that's typed in, and this means is the number this year greater than the number last year. So the number this year that I typed in, this year was 5, and the number last year was 4. So is 5 greater than 4? And that evaluates to be either true or false. And so in this case, 5 is greater than 4, so it's going to make this true. Remember, is this year greater is a variable that is a Boolean data type. So that's all it holds. It doesn't hold numbers, it doesn't hold strings, it doesn't hold numbers. It just holds whether or not something is true or false. So this is going to be true.
The last Congress, Republicans included reform.
And then we have our output statement, and it says this year's competition, and now I've got a placeholder, contestants. You notice this is all inside of double quotes. Last year's competition placeholder, contestants, and this year's has, and then another placeholder, contestants. And what happens is that, let me put this, I wish I could put this all on one line, but we'll put it on 2 lines, so it'll fit on 2 lines here. Computers start counting at 0, so this is the first one. This is the first variable. You notice there's a comma after the double quotes. So this is the first variable. And last year, I typed in 4 for last year. This year, I typed in 5 for this year. And then revenue expected. And it's going to, it calculated the revenue, the number of contestants this year, times the entry fee. So this year was 5, so 5 times 25, 125. So revenue is going to be 125. And not only did we calculate this and store it into revenue, but this is an integer value. And so before I print it out, I'm going to convert this number into a string. And not only am I going to turn it into a string, but the C, you see this C between the double quotes? That means turn it into dollar signs and commas. So, so let's see that when it runs. So I'm going to press the enter key, and it comes back and it says the last year's competition had 4 contestants. This year's has 5 contestants. That's what we typed in there. The revenue expected is $125. So this C means that it put this dollar sign in the beginning, and it put a decimal value with two places after it for the number of cents. Well, in this case, it's going to end up be a whole number, but this is a good way to format something. We could also tell it, if we wanted to, that we didn't want any decimal, anything after the decimal place, if we wanted to, in here, but we'll leave it this way. It is, and here's another placeholder, that this year's competition is bigger than last year. So this is going to be replaced with this Boolean variable that's either true or false. Remember that we have up here we determine, my goodness, where is it? Here it is. We determine whether or not the number from this year is greater than the number from last year. So that's either true or false. And so this is going to say either true or false. And in this case, it came back and said true, that it is true that this year's competition is bigger than last year's. Okay, that's all there is to this one. I'll stop it there.